Well, it's an honor to be here. Certainly, as you said, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, the subcommittee on Strategic Forces, which deals a lot with space. I'm on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, the subcommittees on the environment, which deals a lot with weather, which today I'm talking about, especially regarding space. And I'm on the subcommittee on space. So it seems like every time I turn around in this new job I have as a member of Congress, I'm talking about space. Interestingly, even before I got to Congress, I was involved in a small venture with private placement offerings. Never went big time, but it was called the Rocket Racing League. Is anybody here familiar with that? That is a topic for another day. But we'll just say that, that I've had an interest in space for a long time, and certainly as a Navy pilot, I have relied heavily on space gadgets, not knowing how heavily I was relying on it until I got here. But certainly there's a lot going on. The world is shifting quickly, and members of Congress need to understand that and be aware and be supportive of the shifts that are occurring. There are a number of organizations and people that have helped me get smart on space as it relates to my committees, and I'd like to mention them. I came to the space business, the Washington Space Business Roundtable a number of, I guess, months ago now, just to get to know some of you, and I did. And a lot of people in this room have been helpful in me gaining a better understanding of what the space industry is up to, and I'd like to mention some of them. Kay Sears and Mylan Pride from the Intelsat team, Chuck Cinnamon from Loral, Tip Osterthaler and Nicole Robinson on the SES team, Ann Miller-Racy from Planet IQ, Brian Wilson from Northrop Grumman, Steve Bachman from Boeing, Mary Springer from DRS, Scott Goods from Lockheed Martin, and Hope Buckman, Deborah Lepore, and Jill Pomeroy from Ball Aerospace. And I just want to make sure everybody here, and Patricia, you as well, I just want to make sure everybody here understands that this is a job that requires people like you in this room that deal with this on a daily basis to get up to speed and understand the issues that are at stake here. So thank you, and if I missed somebody, I apologize. I'm sure I'll regret having missed somebody later. What I'm talking about today is weather, and I think it's important for people to understand, even those of us that have a very limited government mindset, like me, we believe that there is a role for the U.S. government to be involved in weather. At the very least, for military operations and national security. That's at the very least. I can tell you, as somebody who has flown combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've flown counter-drug missions in Central and South America, I have been very dependent on weather products that come from the U.S. government. It's not by accident that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army were the first to launch weather satellites back in the 1960s. And I can tell you that when those forecasts are not good, it puts us in jeopardy, and in many cases it's fatal. And I've got on my agenda here that I'm supposed to tell you a couple of stories, which I wrote the speech, so I'm going to tell you a couple stories about near fatal experiences that I've had as a Navy pilot. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, I'm gonna continue going. We have a couple of things, just so everybody knows. When I leave here, I've got a fundraiser, and even that is going to be cut short because we've got votes. By the way, fundraiser, if anybody wants to come, write a big check. I'm glad you laughed at that. But really, no. So what I would say is that even limited government conservatives believe that there is a role for the government to be involved in space or in weather. Beyond military applications, all aspects of the American economy depend on weather. Transportation, utility companies, agriculture, financial services, tourism, and more. Pretty much every piece of the American economy is affected by weather and good forecasts. As population centers have grown, the devastating impact of severe weather events has also grown on those population centers. And I can tell you, as a guy who represents the state of Oklahoma, we have felt those effects as much as anybody in the country. In Moore, Oklahoma, the tornado that devastated Moore in my state, it killed 24 people and did $2 billion worth of damage in my home state. That's a big deal. Weather forecasting is important. Unfortunately, the United States ranks just 4th in accurate and timely weather forecasting, in spite of the fact that we spend a whole lot more on weather forecasting than the entire rest of the world combined. And yet we rank only 4th. Now NOAA is doing some good things to mitigate this. Is anybody here from NOAA? Can I dime anybody out from NOAA? NOAA is doing some really good things to mitigate this. First, they're investing in high-performance computing, which is necessary for the numerical weather models that we use to actually predict weather. We're getting more data going into these models. So the way it works, you've got all these data systems, satellites in space, weather balloons, ground sensors, radars. All these data systems are collecting information on weather, and they're sending it into a data assimilation system, which then goes into a numerical weather model. The challenge is you've got to have high-performance computers that can do all of the calculations so that you can get a weather forecast out early enough to actually predict and warn people of the impending storm or whatever the case may be. So NOAA is correctly making those investments. Second, NOAA is exploring options to utilize commercial satellite companies. I believe the United States can dramatically improve weather forecasting, reduce costs, and reduce risk by empowering the commercial weather and satellite industries. This is why I introduced the Weather Forecasting Improvement Act of 2014. And I want to anchor here for a second. There's two people that were very supportive in getting this bill passed, and it passed the full House of Representatives. Chris Stewart was the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Environment within the Science Committee, and Susan Bonamici was the ranking member. And because of their leadership, my bill, the Weather Forecasting Improvement Act, went through the subcommittee without any opposition. It went through the full Science Committee without any opposition, and then it went to the floor of the House, and it passed without any opposition. That shows you the bipartisan support for this kind of activity. There is resistance out there, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So I'd like to thank them. If it doesn't pass the Senate this session, which there's a slim chance, but I don't think it's very good, I will reintroduce it next year early, and certainly we need to get input from the Senate to make sure that they're ready to go on it when we get it passed. The importance of this bill is that it will enable weather data to flow in the classic model from the government sector to the private sector. As in other space ventures, the government should be involved in the initial phases of developing unproven technology. And then once that technology is proven, the risks are quantified, then the private sector can pick it up and carry it. And this is a model that NOAA should adopt. In fact, if you look, I know there's a lot of satellite communications folks in the room, and there's satellite imagery folks in the room. This is a model that the DoD has already employed for a whole host of reasons, but it has been very successful. We need to move from the government owning and operating huge satellites to a day when the government can purchase data from private satellite operators. The historic government monopoly of weather satellites and associated data is now at the point of creating unnecessary costs, delays, and risks that could dramatically degrade U.S. weather forecasting. Right now we really have two polar orbiting satellites that provide up to 80% of the data that goes into our numerical weather models. Those polar orbiting satellites, DMSP on the military side, and of course NPP on the NOAA NASA side. And these satellites collect a ton of data that go into the data assimilation systems and then the numerical weather models. And when you watch TV, when you watch the Weather Channel or whatever your local channel, when you watch the weather go across a region the next 3 to 7 days, the forecast, you watch the weather develop and move, those models are taking data from these polar orbiting satellites. Now the challenge is the NPP satellite is almost at the end of its useful life. And in fact, that's a really big deal. It's the only satellite right now that is doing the afternoon orbit. So these satellites are in a sun-synchronous orbit, which means they're always, over the Earth at the same point in the day as the sun goes around the Earth. The Earth goes around the sun, the Earth turns, I should say. I'm not going to leave the script anymore because I'll start confusing myself. Just know I understand that the earth does turn. Some members of Congress might argue that I don't understand that, but that's okay. The challenge is this: the NPP satellite is coming to the end of its useful life. Its replacement, the JPSS satellite, the Joint Polar Satellite System, is delayed. It's not going to be launched now until 2017. And by the way, it could get delayed again. And this is going to leave a gap in that data that goes into the numerical weather model that enables us to accurately predict catastrophic events like tornadic thunderstorms. It enables us to predict severe snowstorms and severe floods. These are the kind of things that we could lose. In fact, NOAA has said, quote, that this data gap, if not mitigated, will erode everyday weather forecasts and expose the nation to a 25% chance of missing extreme event forecasts that matter most. A 25% chance that we will miss the extreme weather forecasts that matter most. That includes thunderstorms, floods, winter storms, and even worse, when you think about hurricanes. It puts us in a position where we're not going to be able to accurately predict where the hurricane will make landfall. So what this will result in is people evacuating when they don't need to evacuate. Or people maybe not evacuating when they do need to evacuate. And these false alarm evacuations have, every year already, they cost the economy about $1 billion annually. So whether you're from a tornado-prone state like Oklahoma, or whether you're from a state on the East Coast or on the Gulf of Mexico, this data gap from NPP to JPSS is huge, and it will affect weather forecasting, it will affect the economy of the United States, and it's something that absolutely has to be mitigated. Now, the challenge is this, and some people say, well, we can depend on Russia, we can depend on China, we can depend on Europe, and we partner with Europe on a lot of things. I, for one, don't believe that we should depend on Europe for our weather data. Of course, China and Russia, it makes sense we don't want to depend on them because there's a national security interest here. I talked about how we use weather in the military. But with Europe, the challenge is this. Do you want American taxpayers to be sending their money to foreign governments, and along with it, that money comes with capital investment, and it comes with jobs? We're going to be exporting all of this. And the United States should not be in that position. We should be the leader of the world in weather, as we have been in the past. Right now, we're only ranked number 4. For these reasons and more, NOAA, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, the Department of Commerce, Office of the Inspector General, and the $4 billion a year U.S. commercial weather industry, together, they said they wanted an analysis of alternatives to deal with this JPSS gap. The report came back. Many recommendations to mitigate the gap are fantastic. And these are the kind of reports that are important for me as a member of Congress. I'm a Navy pilot. As it relates to how do we deal with this gap, it's not my area of expertise. I've not done this before. But when you get these kind of reports from private companies that can say, here's what's ultimately going to be the result, and here's some mitigation steps, this is how I, as a member of Congress, make good decisions. And they had some great recommendations in there. But I will tell you that it fell short in one significant way. And that is, it missed the underlying cause of the gap. The question is, yes, we can mitigate the gap. The question is, what caused the gap so it doesn't happen again in the future? That's the challenge that I, as a legislator, want to be able to address. Here's the challenge. My opinion, the gap was caused by two things: shrinking congressional budgets and the inability of a government monopoly of satellites to be able to respond to the shifting budgets. Those are two things. Now, we in Congress can deal with both of those. The taxpayer is underserved by the government monopoly of satellites, of weather satellites, in 3 ways. Number 1, inflexibility. Number 2, increased risks. And number 2 and number 3, higher costs. 1, 2, and 3, and the earth still turns. First, flexibility. Flexibility is necessary to benefit from the rapid technological advancements and shifting priorities that come with those rapid technological advances. When a government monopoly purchases a single satellite, maybe for $11 billion, at the extent of its budget, and then either those budgets get cut or the costs increase, there is no flexibility there. This is why programs are often canceled, or programs are cannibalized to fund other programs. A recent example is the NPOS program that a lot of people in this room are familiar with, that got canceled after massive taxpayer investments. And I can tell you as a member of Congress and somebody who has to go home and face his constituents, taxpayers are sick and tired of investing millions and billions of dollars into programs that ultimately end up canceled. They don't understand how that happens. Well, that happens because you've got changing budgets and a government monopoly that controls where we spend the money. The second issue that we have is that the government is incentivized to increase risk when you have a government monopoly. So number 1 is inflexibility. Number 2, there's additional risk. And here's why. I'll give you an example. NOAA has reduced costs by packing more sensors onto a single satellite that will eventually be launched by a single rocket. This is how the $11 billion JPSS program has been designed. If the already delayed JPSS-1 satellite is completely removed as a result of a launch failure, or some kind of space debris, or maybe the power system doesn't work, I'm sure that won't happen. But it could. I mean, if it did, then the question is this. We will have an afternoon gap that will be longer than months or a year. We're talking about we'll have an afternoon gap that will last until the JPSS-2 satellite is built and launched. That means weather forecasting is going to be severely degraded during that period of time. That's the position we're in. Much of that data from the afternoon orbit goes into our numerical weather prediction models. That data would go away if there was a launch failure on JPSS-1. Weather forecasts would be degraded, and given the human and economic stakes in today's population centers, the risks are too high, and the all-or-nothing approach must be mitigated. So, number 1, you don't have the flexibility. Number 2, the government monopoly is incentivized to increase more risk because they're trying to lower costs. And number 3, the worst part, maybe not the worst part, but one of the bad parts, is that all of the costs for the program are spread across one customer, the U.S. government, and or the U.S. taxpayer. This is another reason we need to change the model. And I want to be clear, I am not suggesting that JPSS-1 or JPSS-2 be canceled. That's not what I'm saying. I do believe the federal government has a role in weather prediction, and that the JPSS program includes sensors and capabilities that the private sector is not prepared to replace. However, going forward, NOAA should adopt Department of Defense principles that include the disaggregation of space for the purpose of resiliency. That's the model that NOAA should adopt. It's the same model that we've seen successful in the Department of Defense as it relates to imagery and communications. Smaller satellites riding on more rockets result in greater resiliency and less risk. Sensors can also ride on other satellites as hosted payloads to reduce both cost and risk. The DoD has already implemented this model with satellite communications and imaging, and NOAA should adopt this model for weather data. NOAA can accomplish this by purchasing data from a robust and diverse weather collection industry. In this data purchase model, the government will buy data rather than hardware. Buy data rather than hardware. And unleash the creative and innovative power of competition and entrepreneurial capitalism. If the private sector can provide the data, the government needs to allow it to do so. The DoD adopted this model decades ago, and the private sector, especially in imagery, the private sector created applications that previously were not even imagined. And today we have an economy that depends heavily on things like Google Maps. The energy industry relies on the imagery from space. Real estate development, agriculture, so much more. Our economy has come to recognize that there is value for the imagery apart from just the US government and the intel community. And this has grown our economy. It has made us better as a nation. The data purchase model for weather would also mitigate the impending gap that I've already discussed. It would leverage the nimbleness and innovation of the private sector. It would spread the risk across the risk and costs among private equity as well as foreign governments, and relieve the pressure on NOAA's budget, of which half is spent on government-owned and operated satellites. With numerous companies launching multiple smaller satellites, we can expand the amount of data available, which is better for the numerical weather models. In other words, you're going to get better weather forecasts. We can collect the data more frequently, deliver the data more quickly, and achieve better weather prediction while also spreading the risk and the cost. You know, if we were to allow the private satellite industry to sell data to NOAA directly, what would happen is that data would not only be sold to NOAA, it would be sold to private companies. It would also be sold to foreign governments. And the United States of America would no longer be in the position of owning a government monopoly for satellite as it relates to control and operation of these satellites. That's how we spread the risk. That's how we reduce the risk to my tax-paying constituents. And ultimately, we get better data, better weather prediction models. We get everything can be improved if we get the government out of the way and allow the private sector to develop this industry, just as it has done with imagery. Look at what has happened with imagery. How many, I mean, today we got here because of Google Maps. The private sector is ready. There are firms, Planet IQ and GeoOptics, are raising private capital and could launch numerous GPS radio occultation satellites to mitigate the data gap in about 2 years. Tempest and GeoMetWatch are in a similar position, planning to launch hyperspectral sensors. Just as a cost comparison, JPSS is an $11 billion program that will last through 2025. Depending on when it is launched, the annualized cost of it is just around $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion per year. Planet IQ plans to sell GPS RO data to the US government for about $40 million per year. 1.4 billion or 40 million. That's less than 3% of the cost with no money required up front. The government only has to pay for the data it receives. To be fair, GPS RO data and data attained from JPSS impact forecasts in very different ways. In some instances, data assimilation systems and numerical weather models will need to be adjusted to account for the new and additional data from private companies. This is why I included observation system experiments and observation system simulation experiments in the Weather Forecasting Improvements Act of 2014, which soon will be 2015. When you think about an observation simulation experiment, here's what it does. I talked earlier about all the different sensors out there that go into these numerical weather models. You've got satellite, weather balloons, aircraft, UAVs, ground sensors, radars. All the different sensors are collecting the data. It goes into a data assimilation system and then into a numerical weather model. What an observation system experiment does, an OSE, is it takes one of those elements out. What would happen if we didn't have the afternoon orbit from NPP? If all that data was lost and we couldn't put it into our assimilation system and it couldn't go into the numerical weather model, how would that affect the forecast you get on the evening television? Or the forecast you get on your iPhone or on your computer screen? The question is, how would that affect it? So you can remove a piece of data, and there you have your, that's what your experimentation is for. Now, observation system simulation experiments are, instead of removing data and seeing how it affects the weather forecast, put new data in. Let's say we build a new satellite, or the private sector brings something that hasn't previously been used, and you put new data in. How does that affect the weather forecast? Does it make it better, or does it not change it? This is a big reason why we have to have OSEs and OSSEs. The reason is because we're going to get a whole lot new data from the private sector. And whether it happens slowly or quickly it is going to depend on decisions we make in Congress and decisions that NOAA makes. But ultimately, it will happen. That's why OSEs and OSSEs are so important. To unleash the commercial weather satellite industry, we need NOAA to send a signal that it will purchase data from the private sector. This could be as simple as a letter of intent. It could be an anchor customer. NOAA could be an anchor customer for a lot of these small companies that are coming out of the ground if anchor tenancy lends itself to that. Here's what's required by 1993 NASA Authorization Act. To be an anchor tenant, the government allows you to be the government allows NOAA to be an anchor tenant if it meets these 6 conditions. The good or service meets the mission requirements. The good or service is cost effective. There is a competitive process. So far, everything is met. Now, you could argue that the mission requirements might have to shift a little bit because the data that comes from the private sector would be different than the data that comes from the JPSS. But at the same time, the assimilation systems and the numerical weather models could be adjusted to account for new and different data. Number 4, existing or potential customers for the good or service other than the U.S. government have been specifically identified. Here's the key point here. Existing or potential customers for the good or service. Friends, there's not going to be any customers until NOAA steps up and says, I'm going to be a customer. As soon as NOAA says, I'm a customer, these satellites get launched, and you're going to see private sector industry as well as foreign governments buying this data in droves. NOAA needs to step up and be a customer. Number 5, the long-term viability of the venture is not dependent on continued government markets or non-reimbursable government support, and private capital is at risk. Friends, the requirements are met. This could be a government tenancy kind of opportunity. And in fact, it's been proven by the Department of Defense. As better forecasting is done with the private sector, and not only better forecasting, but lower costs, then NOAA can actually shift its resources to other areas. One area I would like to see NOAA plus up is the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma. The National Severe Storms Laboratory is using phased array radar, which is a technology I'm familiar with as a Navy pilot. Stacy Ladwood, would you raise your hand for a second? Stacy is the wife of a friend that I used to fly with in the United States Navy. And it's a pleasure. He now works in the Pentagon, which is why they're here. And thank you for coming to this. I didn't realize she was so involved in this industry, but she is. But here's where I like, and I brought that up because I thought about phased array radar, which is what we fly with in the Navy. And we use it on Navy ships. Now we're using it in weather. We're using it in weather for a very specific purpose, which is to target little particles inside of a cloud. Now you've got all this energy that you can direct into a tiny little cloud, and you can look at the little particles in that cloud, and you can take those particles and then that movement, you can put it into a data assimilation system and put that into the numerical weather model. And because they've been advancing this technology at the University of Oklahoma, they're now able to predict tornadoes well over an hour in advance, and they've done it at the University of Oklahoma. Depending on the conditions, it's not always that easy, but dang it, they can do it a good portion of the time. We need better numerical, I guess I'd say higher performing computers in order to calculate the information that's coming from these radars. But friends, where NOAA should focus, in my opinion, they should be focused on the science and the research and the technologies that right now are not sufficiently developed for the private market to advance them and to innovate and to bring in private capital. And if NOAA were to do that, we could advance these technologies and we could move to a day when the entire country gets, maybe not an hour, but well more than the current 13 minutes, which is what we currently get with the, right now we're using warn on detection. Once you detect a tornado, then you warn people, and people are getting 13 minutes. We can move to a day when we have warn on forecast, and that would be a day when we have 0 deaths from tornadoes in a state like mine, Oklahoma. You can see why I care about this. My constituents have to deal with it every year. And if we were to utilize America's resources, maybe not appropriately, but in a different way, we could advance technologies where they need to be advanced using the government, where right now the private sector will not invest. And we can use the private sector to lower costs and improve the data that goes into our models so that we can ultimately get to a better day of forecasting and lower costs and redistribute the resources to other places that will save lives and property today. I'm getting the signal from my guy in the back, and he's saying I've got to hit the road. But I just want to let everybody know what an honor it is to be here. Like I said, I've been to this group before. I've met a lot of you through my experiences. It's been an honor to get to know you. If there are others here, you know, stop by my office sometime, call my office. I'm in 216 Cannon, the Cannon House office building. I'm dealing with space all the time. Communication satellites, I've got a lot of people in the room that I've been dealing with on the communication side. And I'll say this as I leave. On the communication side, the Department of Defense is buying communications, commercial satellite communications with one-year spot contracts that are not efficient. It costs the government too much. And at the same time, they're doing it through DISA under the Overseas Contingency Operation Funds, which are going away. ComSatcom, commercial satellite communications, is not going away. It will be here forever, for the long term. And as such, we've got to figure out a way to get ComSatcom purchases out of the Overseas Contingency Operation budget, where it's purchased in one-year increments, and get it into programmatic financing inside the Department of Defense so that we can serve the warfighter in a better way. That's all I'm going to say on that. Maybe we'll talk more later. But it's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to serve here in Washington, D.C., and certainly this is an industry that I'm proud to represent on the committees that I'm on. So thank you guys so much.